Hello, everyone, and welcome to RNC Presents Legally Unwrapped. This is the podcast where we unpack your favorite shows and movies through a legal lens, discuss how representative they really are of our reality. I'm your cinematic counsel, Brikena Rochette. I'm the co-founder and attorney at Rochette Consulting, and joining me today is Tali Borges, an associate at Richards Advocacy, where they conduct workplace investigations. We are both attorneys practicing law in Ontario, Canada, so that's the jurisdiction where our information will be informed by. Today, we're diving into the fascinating world of one of television's most beloved workplace comedies, The Office. Now, for those of you who have never seen the show before, first of all, go see it. And no, I'm not paid to say that. It's just my strongly held opinion that you do. And secondly, the show is a hilarious mockumentary that follows a group of quote unquote typical office workers. So Tali, let's get to it. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Bri. It's great to be here with you today, and I'm excited.
Me too. Okay, so the episode that we're going to focus in on, because The Office spans from many, many seasons, is season 2, episode 2, called Sexual Harassment. In this episode, Toby Flenderson from HR gives a seminar on sexual harassment to the staff. But then Michael comes in and conducts his own misguided version of the seminar, which results, in our case, multiple employees, namely Jim, Pam, Stanley, Angela, and Phyllis, filing multiple complaints of sexual harassment and discrimination. That doesn't actually happen in the show, but for the sake of our purposes, we're going to say that it does. In their interviews, Michael's behavior both prior to and after Toby's seminar are cited, which leads you to believe that this isn't the first time occurrence, but rather a pattern. You also learn that other employees, namely Todd Packer and Dwight Schrute, also feel comfortable to have misappropriate, sexually explicit conversations with their boss, aka Michael, thereby further contributing to the hostile work environment plaguing the company. Now, you're the lawyer that's put on this file to conduct this workplace investigation. Can you walk us through the typical process for conducting a workplace investigation into allegations such as these?
First of all, I was very excited when you mentioned that we would be discussing The Office, because I am The Office fan to the extent that my daughter is actually called Cece, just like Jim and Pam. So
That's amazing.
So that's the kind of fan that I am. In any event, I find this episode extremely interesting because there is a lot to unpack. And it's funny because it's only 20 minutes, but it's always like
just jam-packed. It just goes bam, bam, bam with all of the stuff.
Exactly. So there's a lot to unpack there, especially from a workplace investigation perspective. First of all, it is important for us to understand context. Context is always very relevant. So for us to understand, why do these investigations take place in the first place? So knowing the purpose assists us in understanding the process kind of thing. In Ontario, the Ontario Human Rights Code provides that every workplace should be free from harassment and discrimination. When an organization undertakes to investigate an incident, it is basically what it is doing to attempt to comply with these human rights provisions and legislation. Usually, when the organization becomes aware of a potential workplace incident, including harassment, sexual harassment, discrimination, or toxic work environment, they have this duty. What this duty looks like will vary according to the internal policies. Organizations and companies, they can have different internal policies. They can have internal policies that are more thorough, that are more detailed, or that are more general. But there is a common thread amongst all these policies and the workplace investigation generally, which is procedural fairness. Sometimes when we talk about procedural fairness, people may forget that this is not a criminal procedure. The consequences of an investigation, they're very different. No one is going to jail because of an investigation, right? So of course, the procedural fairness standard is also going to be somewhat different. So usually the process will start with someone bringing a complaint, or if the organization becomes aware of an incident, it can usually undertake its own investigation regardless of someone bringing a complaint. So whoever is investigating, the investigator will hear the complainant, if there is one, will then hear witnesses, will look at the evidence, sometimes emails, sometimes text exchanges, sometimes voice messages, because nowadays with WhatsApp, and all of those new technologies, so Facebook and all that, you can also have voice messages, voice recordings as well.
I drive all the time, so I just send voice notes to the dismay of all of my friends who can't listen to them until after work hours.
Exactly. So you can imagine that nowadays there are lots of investigations that we will actually hear out these recordings. And then as a next step, after gathering this evidence, listening to what the complainant has to say, the investigator will allow a chance for the respondent to review this evidence and also to give his or her own version of the fact. Now, of course, the respondent may question everything altogether, say, no, this never happened. But it's also very often for the respondent to say, yes, this happened to a certain extent, until such and such happened, I kind of agree to what the complainant said. But then there is their own version of events. Exactly. So once the investigator has gathered all of this evidence, they will consider credibility, reliability of each one of these witnesses and come to a conclusion on whether the incident occurred or not. And
Right.
then the investigator will review the policy and apply to the facts. And then once this is done, usually it is the organization who will make the final decision. What investigators can do, if asked to do so, is make a recommendation. They can definitely do that. Oftentimes, they're not asked for a recommendation. They're only asked to investigate the fact, interpret and apply the policy and applicable legislation.
You're more of a fact-finding machine as opposed to the ones that make the ultimate rules and decisions when it comes to what the organization can and can't do at the end of the day.
Exactly. An investigator can make a finding of fact that a serious incident occurred, and yet the company may decide not to terminate the employment or not to impose any consequences. So this is really not for within the investigator's purview.
You spoke a little bit about how you approach gathering evidence and interviewing both parties, but what if some employees are reluctant to speak out, either out of embarrassment or fear of retaliation, or even, they don't speak out of loyalty for their boss or the potential for there to be something self-incriminating that comes out of it for them. An example that I can say is Dwight Schrute. In the show, he's constantly looking for Michael's approval, right? So one of the things that he does in this particular episode is we learn that Michael loves to forward sexually inappropriate emails to his staff. It's he's called the forwarding king. Self-proclaimed, of course. And at one point, Dwight is showing monkeys engaged in sexual activity videos to Michael. He's doing this via his work computer, and he's doing it in the presence of his other coworkers who are hearing this interaction between Michael and Dwight. And Michael's an active participant in this. And of course, Dwight wants to be a part of whatever Michael's doing. So he's showing him these videos and he's asking him, hey, do you want me to send you this video so that you can forward it to everybody? How would you go about interviewing someone like Dwight, for example, who has so much loyalty and friendship towards Michael and has also maybe done something wrong himself out of trying to be accepted in this kind of toxic environment that Michael has helped create?
That's actually a very good question.
I try, that's the podcast hostess.
Well, first of all, one of the big challenges is that, especially witnesses, they might not want to give their evidence. Ultimately, as an investigator, we can't compel them to attend. Investigators don't have that power. Investigations depend and rely a lot on people willingly coming forward and being truthful about their recollection. That's also why we have confidentiality in place. So confidentiality serves that purpose of ensuring that that's a safe space for someone to speak. And confidentiality also means that parties and witnesses are not supposed to be discussing what happened while there is an investigation, because that means that they will be influencing each other. In Dwight's case, we can see that he is mirroring his boss and trying to get his approval. What an investigator would look at is not only Dwight's credibility, but also his reliability. And reliability goes to the point of how someone perceives reality. What I understand from the show is that Dwight perceives this as being funny, appropriate, and that's okay to do that. So this is something that would go into an investigator's analysis of, if Dwight tells me he thinks that everyone in the office did that and no one really cared, an investigator might take it with a grain of salt because of reliability aspects of how Dwight perceives his surroundings and perceives his own environment. What we see in the show is that Dwight doesn't have that awareness, right? So Dwight doesn't seem like someone that would be uncomfortable in disclosing these facts. In reality, it seems to me that as a witness, Dwight might be very straightforward in
Right.
what he saw and observed, but interview may be affected by his own ability to understand his surroundings.
We were talking about sexual harassment, and let's say you are maybe not the complainant, maybe the company has realized that this is a problem, and you as an employee have faced this, but you might be reluctant to speak. I mean, you're not even the one that issued the complaint in the first place. And I know you talked about confidentiality agreements, but let's say like in the office, it's quite a small knit company in that specific branch, right? So it's not difficult to ascertain who said what for the most part.
Confidentiality is not the same thing as anonymity. So someone reading the report, even if the witness is not named, could reasonably infer and make logical conclusions on who these witnesses are. That said, usually reports are not shared widely within the organization. It's usually for the decision maker. And sometimes, depending on the policy, reports need to be shared with the complainant and the respondent. This will vary and will depend on the policy wording. Yes, it is a concern, and witnesses have to be aware that even if the process is confidential,
Right.
an informed party reading the report would be able to identify who they are.
Do you usually see that as a challenge potentially in sexual harassment investigations that you might have been a part of in some way? Have you seen that it might be problematic to ascertain the evidence that you need because the complainants are, or not even the complainants, but those who have fallen victim to maybe an employer in a sexual harassment situation, they might feel very uncomfortable speaking out against an employer?
It's not uncommon, which is also one of the reasons why complainants, respondents, and in certain cases, especially in the examples that you mentioned of sexual harassment, witnesses may bring a support person so that they can feel that they are in a safe space. That said, usually policies, they also have provisions on reprisals. So if for any reason this witness experiences reprisal within the workplace setting, that's a new breach. That's a new breach that could lead to a new investigation. So we often do remind participants of non-reprisal provisions as well.
Again, this show, The Office, makes light of some very potentially dark situations, and we're going to keep that in mind as we move forward, but we're just trying to use the show as a way to showcase to other people how workplace investigations are conducted. So I just want to make sure that our audience knows that in no way are we poking fun at serious misconduct situations like the ones that if Michael was a real employer. Now let's talk about, so we've been talking about how we gather evidence. So let's say we have now conducted some interviews and this is the evidence against Michael. Jim and Angela have launched complaints against Michael regarding his inappropriate email forwards. Jim says that the last inappropriate email forward that he received from Michael was titled 50 Signs Your Priest May Be Michael Jackson. When you ask Michael about it, he says, well, I'm, the king of forwards and I just forward this. I don't write it myself. Mm-hmm. And then Angela, in her complaint says, I hate getting these filthy emails. She says that they are disgusting and inappropriate, and they say send it to 10 other people or you'll have bad luck. So that's Jim and Angela's evidence. Pam says that Michael brought in a blow-up doll after their sexual harassment seminar by Toby. He tries to make a joke and then tries to insinuate that she should make out with a blow-up doll. And he also has a sexual bath joke that he says about her. And he says, times have changed a little. And even though we're still a family here at Dunder Mifflin, families grow. And at some point, the daddy can't take a bath with the kids anymore. I am upper management, and it would be inappropriate for me to take a bath with Pam as much as I might want to. So even when he thinks he understands what's going on, he seems to still make a sexually inappropriate joke. Then Phyllis comes, and she says that Michael told her that she looked old like a grandmother. And in an odd attempt to apologize to her for his making fun of her appearance, He tries to kiss her and says that the only thing he is worried about is getting a boner from being around her. And then Stanley says that Michael has made sexually inappropriate comments about the picture of his high school daughter on his desk, which he obviously is very grossed out by. And then even Toby, the HR guy, says that Michael's making fun of his marital status and the fact that he's divorced. He says Toby is in HR, which technically means he works for corporate. So he's really not a part of our family. Also, he's divorced. So he's really not a part of his family either. Just to make light of a horrible thing to say to someone. But still, now you have this evidence against Michael. People basically saying, I was there. He said this to me. He sent this directly to me. So now you have documentation against him. You have multiple people saying that this is occurring. So, you've got kind of strength in numbers in this particular case. It seems to be more maybe cut and dry than other cases where it's more difficult to have people speak out against their employer, for example. And then to top it all off, they're saying that he's contributing to a toxic work environment and a hostile work environment because other employees feel safe enough to discuss really inappropriate topics with him in front of other staff members and coworkers. So we already discussed how Dwight felt comfortable, sharing videos of monkeys having sexual intercourse. But one that I think is slightly more disgusting in a number of ways is there's another individual who we get introduced to in the show called Todd Packer. And Todd Packer is described as Michael's best friend. And Michael has many best friends throughout the show. It depends on the episode, really. But Todd Packer and him went through the corporate ladder kind of together. But obviously, Michael was really good at sales, so he's now the manager. Anyway, so Todd comes in. They're discussing how someone higher up in corporate just got dismissed for sexual harassment. Michael goes up to him and he goes, hey, have you heard the gossip? So now you even see the manager trying to get into the gossip and the rumor mills, which it's coming from the top, right? And Todd goes, oh yeah, I know all about that. And within that conversation proceeds to call women stupid, calls women bitches, proceeds to say that, they're bimbos. So he's very derogatory towards women. And then he even calls one of the men in the show a little bitch. He uses derogatory claims against the LGBTQ members by saying things like, hey, are you still queer? These are just constant throughout the episode. Like he says things like, who has two thumbs and likes to bang your mom? And goes, this guy. These are all things that Michael condones throughout the entire episode and can't ever stand up to Todd. What do we do in a situation where, it's the employer, he has made this hostile work environment, you now know the evidence, what happens next?
From what you mentioned, and really throughout this episode, what I find very interesting is that the very, very end, Michael Scott goes to the warehouse guys and he says, hey guys, do you have any jokes that I can tell when corporate comes or something along those lines, right? And so the warehouse guys what do you mean, right? And then they start making up jokes about Michael, that his pants are tight or whatnot. And then Michael doesn't like that. It's very interesting because the show actually portrays the dynamic that the same person who was permitting and allowing a toxic workplace environment and for inappropriate jokes to be made is not comfortable with making jokes about him. Right. So it's very
of his own medicine.
Exactly. So it's very interesting because oftentimes, we can interview respondents. They may have a narrative that, oh, but I didn't mean it in that way. Oh, but I did not, that was not my intention. But intention is not really a requirement. Management is responsible for ensuring that everyone who is under their management is complying with these policies. So you could actually think from that perspective that Michael is not infringing the policy once every time he makes an inappropriate comment, but again and again and again every time that he condones with it. His omission allows for a poised work environment to escalate and to be created.
Right. And it's funny that you said something about intention because at the end of Toby's legitimate sexual harassment HR seminar to the staff, the last thing he says before everybody else kind of jumps into the episode is, so remember, intent is irrelevant. This is what he's talking about. He's saying it doesn't matter if you meant to, it matters what the consequences of those actions are. How do you deal with a manager like Michael Scott who may not fully acknowledge the gravity of the complaints against him.
From a workplace investigation perspective, actually, Michael Scott would not be the most challenging case just because it's so blatantly obvious that his comments are inappropriate and that they make the other employees uncomfortable because they're not subtle, right? They're very direct. So the most challenging cases are the subtle ones, which require a lot of context. And for us to build context, you need to have a broader view, right? You can't restrict so much to that one specific phrase in an email, for instance, right? You need a lot more context, so that requires more investigation work. Ultimately, like in Michael's case, it wouldn't be as challenging, I would say. But like I said, the ultimate decision lies with the organization, right? So let's say the investigator concludes, yes, so Michael Scott breached the policy in such and such instances for such and such reasons, and so on and so forth. Does the organization want us to provide a recommendation? They not necessarily want a recommendation. Maybe they already know what the consequences could potentially be. They just want to understand what really happened in that case. It's ultimately a risk for the organization, and they need to make that decision whether or not they want to take on their risk. So it will depend a lot on their risk appetite, I would say. Someone who is who so frequently goes against the policies, that would not be such a hard call. And also, we need to understand that we can have a series of minor incidents, but we can have, for instance, one single incident that is very serious. For instance, when he meant to Phyllis that she gave him a boner or something like that, that's one incident in itself that is serious enough, right? We wouldn't need any of the other things. Ultimately, it's for the organization to say, yes, we want to keep Michael Scott take on this risk. And it's interesting because in that episode, Jane shows up.
And she shows up corporate's lawyer.
Exactly. And then Michael brings in his own lawyer and says, oh, this is my own lawyer. And then she says, no, but the corporate lawyer is here to protect the company and he's your lawyer. You don't need another lawyer, right? If he were the respondent in an investigation, he could have his support person, not necessarily a lawyer. So just to clarify to that point that he would be able to have a support person. That said, it's important to understand that a support person is really just for support. So it's not meant to be answering the questions that investigator asks the respondent. So,
we've talked about compliances with the applicable laws. We've talked about what we can expect from an investigation. So knowing everything that we've kind of discussed today, can you share any best practices or tips for organizations, whether they're fictional or otherwise, that are either currently handling a workplace investigation or that may want to avoid a workplace investigation in the future? Like, what can they do?
Yeah, of course. So first and foremost, the most important thing is have a clear policy in place, right? I understand, most smaller organizations may not have a policy, but you can draft one and have one that not necessarily is a 30 pages code, ethics code. You can have something shorter, but that addresses these kinds of concerns. So it doesn't need to be necessarily extensive, but having a clear policy in place is definitely helpful, and it does reduce the organization's exposure. And it provides clarity to everyone, to employees, to managers, to everyone.
If they are part of a workplace investigation currently, is there any advice that you could give them about how to maybe help the investigation progress, or what are the tips and tricks in that regard?
In addition to the policy, it's also important what we do see in the office to have the workplace training. But to your specific point, if there's currently an investigation in place, it's important to document everything and have everything in writing. So even if you are interviewing complainants and respondents, it's important to have a clear record of any written exchanges like emails or any additional backup documentation regarding the evidence and how these interactions occurred. The respondent also, they need to have an opportunity to address this evidence and to reflect upon them, right? We can't throw around a bunch of information and just say, oh, respond right away on the spot, right? They need to have a meaningful opportunity to respond. So procedural fairness is the cornerstone of workplace investigations. And And like I said, it's not a criminal standard, right? No one is going to jail because of this, but we still need to make sure that particularly the respondent and the complainant, they're ensured procedural fairness. And even if there's no policy in place, you are able to research case law and research what are the standards for procedural fairness in investigations.
That's very informative. And today, the office provided us with a humorous yet insightful look into the real world issues and challenges facing employers and employees alike. Would you say that this show is more or less realistic of the types of things that you might encounter in your profession?
I would say that they take real case situations and take it a little bit to a next level, right? To make
embellish real situations.
Exactly. To make it more, engaging, or, take it to the extreme to make it seem a little bit, funny, but essentially what I do appreciate about The Office is that, first of all, there are the kind of cameras that go behind, like when people are in the office and that, Jim and Pam and Scott, they can speak directly to the camera. It's really almost like a disclosure session, right? Where they're disclosing their own thoughts and perception of events. So I really find that very interesting and very appealing in the show. And the other thing is that it does make us reflect on what is acceptable and what is not acceptable in a workplace environment. Although they're taking it to a next level, to some extent, many of the things do really happen in real life. So I do think that it provides us some, very thoughtful and insightful information that we can really reflect upon and think of how we can have better workplace environments generally.
In order to prevent having to face issues in the future, at Rochette Novell Consulting, we believe in being proactive and not reactive. That said, we would love to help your businesses in drafting your employee handbooks and policies. As we've discovered, these are great ways to proactively make sure that you are creating a transparent and safe environment for both you and your staff. So feel free to contact us today, like I said, for your no obligation free consultation at www.rnconsulting.ca. Links and information will be posted in the description below. Thank you so much, Tali, for joining us today and sharing your valuable insights. And to our viewers, thank you for joining us on our first ever episode of Legally Unwrapped. Keep your eyes open on our social media pages where we announce the next show on the docket. Once again, I'm Brikena Rochette, your cinematic counsel, and that's a wrap.
Thank you so much, Bri. It was great seeing you today and speaking to you today.
Have a great day. Bye, everyone.